In the summer of 1862, a civil engineer named Charles Whittlesey arrived at the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula in Michigan's Upper Peninsula with a commission from the Smithsonian Institution and 11 days to complete a survey before the commercial copper industry, which had been expanding across the Upper Peninsula since the 1840s, buried what the ancient mining had left behind. Whittlesey was 54 years old, experienced in fieldwork, and not given to inference beyond what his measurements supported. He had been brought to the Keweenaw to document the ancient pits before the modern extraction that was reshaping the terrain could destroy what lay below its surface, and he carried into those woods the habits of a man who had spent 30 years converting physical evidence into language that institutions could act on. He had been in the field for 3 days before he understood the scale of what he was walking through. The pits ran along the spine of the ridge in both directions from his starting point, following the copper-bearing rock below in a pattern visible from any high point along the ridge. He counted. He measured. He moved from one excavation to the next and recorded each one in the order he found it. At the end of 11 days, his count had reached well into the thousands, and his count was not yet finished. His final Smithsonian report, published the following winter, estimated the number of ancient pits visible on the Keweenaw at more than 5,000, with additional workings extending across the water to the island of Isle Royale, 20 miles offshore in Lake Superior. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Keweenaw Peninsula extends roughly 65 miles into Lake Superior from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Beneath its spine lies the largest known deposit of native copper on Earth. Native copper occurs in metallic form, in veins and irregular masses and loose surface pieces, formed by geological processes that concentrated it to a purity requiring no smelting, no chemical treatment, no technology beyond extraction and shaping. A piece of native copper can be cold hammered directly into a blade or a hook by striking it against a stone anvil, hardening as it thins, holding an edge without fire. The metal arrives from the ground ready to be used, and the people who found the Keweenaw deposits understood what they had found, with enough clarity to return to it across a span of time that the physical evidence refuses to compress into anything less than several thousand years. The pits Whittlesey documented were not the workings of a population moving through the region and opportunistically extracting what was exposed at the surface. They followed the copper-bearing rock below them with a precision that assumes prior knowledge of where the ore was running before the first excavation began. Where the vein turned, the pit turned with it. Where it ran deep, the pit went deep. Where it narrowed at the surface before widening at depth, the workers cut downward rather than searching laterally for an easier approach. In 2 of the deepest shafts he examined, Whittlesey found timber supports still standing, dry rotted to the point of structural fragility, but intact enough in their placement to confirm they had been cut, shaped, and wedged deliberately into position by someone who understood how an underground opening fails and how to keep it from doing so. The style of notching on those timbers was not one he recognized from any mining tradition he had worked alongside in his career, in the lead mines of the upper Midwest, or in the copper country of Cornwall before he emigrated to the United States. He recorded the observation in his field notes and moved to the next pit. His completed survey covered more ground than he had expected when he accepted the commission. The pits were not evenly distributed across the peninsula. They concentrated along the copper-bearing rock in a pattern that any geologist reading the map Whittlesey produced would recognize immediately as the work of people who knew exactly where the productive ground was and had organized their effort around that knowledge. The pits nearest the shoreline, where the ore had been accessible from the earliest period of extraction, were the oldest and showed the deepest cumulative removal. The pits that followed the vein inland and uphill were shallower, opened in sequence rather than simultaneously, in an order that made sense only if the people who opened them already understood what the older pits had established about the vein's character and direction. They were following a record. The record had been kept in the ground itself. The primary tool of the ancient mining was a stone hammer, shaped by grinding and repeated pecking from the hardest available rock, grooved around the middle where a rawhide sling or a split wooden handle had been attached. The largest recovered specimens weigh more than 30 pounds. Many show wear on both the striking face and the groove, consistent with years of sustained use rather than occasional or seasonal application. The heaviest implements, those above 15 pounds, display groove wear that indicates extended daily use. The lighter hammers show a different wear pattern, consistent with sustained work in a confined horizontal space, such as a narrowing vein approached from the side. Different tools were used for different parts of the same operation by people who understood the differences and applied them accordingly. What the hammers cannot tell, when examined individually, is whether they belong to a permanent resident workforce or to a population that arrived at the Keweenaw specifically for the mining season and departed afterward. The condition of the groove on some specimens, smoothed and rounded by extended contact with a rawhide sling, indicates years of regular use by the same hands returning to the same tools. These are not the tools of an infrequent visitor. Whittlesey's crew recovered several hundred from the pits they opened in 1862. Later surveys across the full Keweenaw and on Isle Royale expanded the inventory through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By mid-century, estimates for the total number of ancient stone mining implements documented from the Lake Superior copper country ranged from 10,000 to numbers considerably higher, depending on which survey's counting methods were applied. The minimum is not a small number. The technique that broke the rock at depth was fire setting. A fire built against the rock face heated it, and a rapid quench with cold water exploited the thermal shock to fracture the stone along its natural grain. The method requires fuel, fire management, and water carried underground simultaneously, and it requires knowing in advance where on the rock face to apply it, because the fracture pattern cannot be directed after the stone has already failed in the wrong place. Managing that cycle in a single active shaft is a logistical problem. Managing it across hundreds of active shafts, which the pit distribution across the Keweenaw implies, was at times the actual situation, is an organizational problem of a different order. The fire-cracked rock that survives in pits Whittlesey documented and in pits examined by later researchers confirms the technique was in regular use. What it implies about the coordination and planning of the workforce responsible for it is not something the standard account of the ancient miners, which describes a small and seasonally mobile population, has addressed with the same precision the physical evidence demands. The copper that came out of those shafts was not being processed near where it was extracted. No casting areas, no finished tool workshops have been found in proximity to the Keweenaw pits in numbers proportionate to the volume of extraction the pit record documents. The copper left the peninsula. It moved through networks that archaeologists have traced by isotopic analysis, which identifies copper artifacts made from Keweenaw deposits by their chemical signature, regardless of where the artifact was eventually recovered. Lake Superior copper, confirmed by isotopic testing, has been found in burial mounds in southern Ohio, in caches in Louisiana, in sites along the Atlantic coast. The trade networks were real. The copper arrived at its destinations. The chain between the Keweenaw pit face and the burial mound in Ohio is documented in the artifact itself. The part of that chain which ran between the pit and the point of departure from the peninsula is not documented in anything the Keweenaw ground has returned. Those stone hammers were held in human hands for hours at a time, underground, by people who needed to eat and sleep and eventually die within a reasonable distance of the work. Every other ancient site that professional archaeology has examined at comparable scale and duration carries the evidence that follows a large human population across time. Fire pits in numbers proportionate to the cooking and warmth the population required, food refuse, the bone fragments of meals, pressed into the soil over generations, the material residue of people making and discarding near where they slept, and the dead themselves in whatever form the relevant burial tradition assigned to them, because populations occupying a fixed productive site for generations leave their dead near the work. The Keweenaw does not show this profile. The fire pits present in areas surrounding the ancient workings are thin and scattered, present in some locations and entirely absent from others. never in numbers proportionate to what the volume of mining the pits document would require if the workers had been living near their work the way every other ancient mining population in the archaeological record has done. Food refuse is sparse where it appears at all. The material culture of daily life is, at the pit sites themselves, close to absent, and the bone, both animal and human, that these sites should have yielded across more than a century and a half of professional excavation has not appeared. Not one identifiable fragment of human skeletal material has been recovered from a Keweenaw or Isle Royale pit site in the full documented history of archaeological work on the Lake Superior copper country. The explanation the discipline has most consistently offered rests on soil chemistry. The Keweenaw's ground is acidic, and acid destroys bone faster than alkaline conditions. Given the time spans involved, which run to several thousand years depending on the evidence being weighed, even large bone deposits might have decomposed past the threshold of recovery. This is not an incorrect observation. Acid soil does destroy bone. The difficulty in applying it uniformly to the Keweenaw record is that the absence is not concentrated in the most acidic sections of the peninsula. It holds across different soil profiles, different drainage conditions, different depths, and different degrees of later disturbance. It holds in excavations where charcoal and plant fiber survived well enough to be radiocarbon dated, which means the preservation environment in those locations protected certain organics and either failed to protect bone or found no bone to protect. The chemistry argument accounts for why bone that was once present might not be recoverable. It does not account for why the same absence holds in locations where the argument's underlying conditions do not apply evenly. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The volume of copper that came out of those pits is the second unresolved category in the same record. Geological surveys conducted across the 20th century estimated the total weight of copper removed from the Lake Superior region during the full ancient mining period. The figures varied by methodology, but even the most careful assessments ran into the hundreds of thousands of tons. Broader estimates, building on the full depth and distribution of the documented pits across the Keweenaw, Isle Royale, and the Wisconsin shore, approached 1 million tons or beyond. The range is wide. The lower end is not a small number. And set against the total weight of every ancient copper artifact ever recovered from archaeological sites across the North American continent, from burial mounds in the Gulf states, from caches in the Ohio River Valley, from trade deposits along routes documented to have moved Lake Superior copper across 2,000 miles of the continent, the figure the artifact record produces is a fraction of the lowest serious estimate for what the ground gave up. The arithmetic of that gap has been noted in every treatment of the subject since Whittlesey published his findings in 1863. It has not closed. Roy Dreyer, a researcher affiliated with Michigan Technological University, who spent decades working the Lake Superior copper region, co-published an analysis of prehistoric copper mining in 1961 with Octave Dutemple. Dreyer's estimate of ancient copper production from the Lake Superior deposits reached well above 500,000 tons. His figure for the total weight of prehistoric copper artifacts then documented in North American collections represented less than 1% of that amount. He set the two numbers beside each other in print and offered no preferred account for the distance between them. The gap was the finding. The gap is still the finding. The communities that surrounded the Lake Superior copper country in the centuries following the ancient mining's end held the deposits in a regard that the historical record catches only in fragmentary glimpses. Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, the Indian agent and ethnologist who worked the Lake Superior region in the 1820s and 30s, documented accounts from communities in the area in which the copper deposits were described as the territory of powerful underground and underwater presences, beings associated with the deep rock who did not yield what they held without consequence. The accounts Schoolcraft collected were not origin stories for the pits themselves. They were accounts of what the pits had already become by the time he was writing, which was a place that the people living nearest to them approached with a specific kind of deliberate care. That is not how a community relates to a site it considers simply old and empty. That is how a community relates to a site it knows holds something it has not finished explaining. Isle Royale carries the same record in a form that removes several of the variables most often used to explain the Keweenaw's gaps. The island sits 20 miles offshore from the peninsula. It had no permanent human population at European contact. The commercial copper industry reached it only late in the 1800s, and the protections that produced Isle Royale National Park, established in 1940, prevented the broad industrial disturbance that reshaped the Keweenaw's surface across a century of extraction. The ancient pit count documented on Isle Royale runs into the hundreds. The island is roughly 45 miles long and 9 miles wide at its widest. In that bounded space, the pattern is the same: stone hammers, fire-fractured rock, extraction following the vein with the same precision documented on the mainland. Survey teams who worked the island pits in the 1920s and 30s were examining ground that in some locations had not been touched since the last ancient miner set a hammer down and left it. What those surveys produced was the same inventory the Keweenaw had produced. The tools were where they should have been. Everything that should have surrounded them at a site occupied long enough was not there. The island offered no downstream industry to complicate the record. No buildings constructed over the ancient sites in the centuries between their abandonment and the surveys that finally documented them. The pit on Isle Royale is as close to the original working as any site the Lake Superior copper country contains. And it gave back exactly what the Keweenaw gave back: the tools, not the people. Isle Royale's soil chemistry is not identical to the Keweenaw's. The acid soil argument does not hold uniformly across both locations. The absence of skeletal material does. The Wisconsin shore to the southwest extends the same pattern to a third location. Ancient copper workings of the same type appear in smaller numbers along the lake's southern margin, surveyed by researchers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and they carry the same physical inventory: stone hammers, fire-cracked rock, displaced material at pit margins, and no human remains. The Minnesota coastline to the west adds further sites to the distribution, across 4 stretches of Lake Superior shoreline where the ancient workings have been professionally documented, covering in total something close to 200 miles of surveyed ground. The finding about skeletal remains has not changed across 150 years of accumulated investigation. The dating of the earliest Keweenaw copper activity has shifted as analytical methods improved. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal recovered at pit sites place the bulk of the ancient mining within the period archaeologists describe as the Old Copper Complex, running roughly from 5,000 to 3,000 years before the present. Evidence of earlier copper use, including worked native copper fragments from archaic period Great Lakes sites, pushes the beginning of organized extraction further back, towards 7,000 years or beyond. The full span of ancient use at the Keweenaw and Isle Royale, by the evidence of the pits and the radiocarbon dates and the cultural distribution of the artifacts, is not less than 3,000 years in its best documented range, and may be considerably more. An operation running at documented intensity for 3,000 years at a fixed location that remains identifiable today produced a physical record that documents the industry with precision. It documents almost nothing about the people who ran it. Whittlesey made one observation in his 1863 Smithsonian report that later researchers returned to more consistently than anything else in the document. He noted that the ancient mining showed no evidence of the gradual contraction that typically precedes the end of a site's occupation in the archaeological record. At most ancient sites of comparable duration, excavation finds a transitional zone, a period of reduced activity, fewer tools, thinner refuse, the physical signature of a population decreasing in numbers or effort before it disappears from the record entirely. The pits, by the evidence of the displaced material at their margins and the tools found inside them, were operated at full intensity until they were not operated at all. He used the word stopped. The operation stopped. It did not taper. Whatever decision ended 4,000 years of organized copper extraction from this peninsula, the physical record shows it as a decision rather than an exhaustion. The Keweenaw National Historical Park, established in 1992, now manages the most substantial surviving evidence of the ancient mining alongside the heritage of the industrial copper rush that followed it in the 19th and 20th centuries. The ancient pits within the park's boundaries are not among its primary interpretive subjects. The industrial period left standing buildings and documentary records that communicate their scale to a visitor in ways that a depression in the ground behind a protective fence does not. The stone hammers are in display cases in Houghton, labeled with date ranges and site names, and they are the best available physical representation of a story that the pits tell only in the language of dimensions and absence. Whittlesey measured those dimensions in the summer of 1862. His report remains the baseline document for the subject. Every treatment since has extended or corrected it at the margins. The two central observations in it have not been materially changed by anything the subsequent century and a half of investigation has produced. The pits stopped all at once. The bones are not there. What the Keweenaw offers, viewed across the full extent of the record, is a set of findings that are internally consistent and externally unresolved. The pits document an industry. The stone hammers document the workforce. The radiocarbon dates and geological surveys document the duration and scale. Surrounding all of it, in every direction the investigation has moved since Whittlesey first walked that ridge, is the same category of absence. No graves, no human physical remains. A small fraction of the copper that the ground proves was removed. The account the physical record gives is complete only to a certain point, and at that point it stops, the way the mining stopped, without transition, without a thinning zone, without the residue of a departure. Whatever the people who built and worked and sustained those pits across 4,000 years chose to leave behind when they finally left, they left the hammers. Everything else went with them, the dead included. The technology to address the central unanswered questions about the Keweenaw has existed for decades. Ground-penetrating radar can locate buried features without excavation. Isotopic analysis can trace copper in any artifact back to its source deposit with enough accuracy to build distribution maps that would extend what is already known about where the metal went. Systematic excavation of pit floors that have never been fully cleared, using methods capable of detecting any surviving bone or organic material, is within the capacity of any adequately funded field program. None of these methods has been applied to the Keweenaw with the specific purpose of resolving what Whittlesey raised in 1863. The copper went somewhere, the people went somewhere, the pits stayed exactly where they were dug. They are the only part of the operation that has never moved, and no one has yet asked them the right questions. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.